I'm Dr. Roger Schwelb, and welcome to Integrate Health. As I said, I'm the host for Integrate Health. I'm a pulmonologist, critical care physician, sleep physician, and also co-founder of medcram.com. But if you want to get a page for all of those links, go to sls-tv.com. That's smartlifestyletv.com. So today we're going to talk about COVID-19 and also the case for light in COVID-19. Now, we've talked about before light and its effect on the circadian rhythm and mood, and also how it can affect our mitochondria. And we're going to expand on that today a little bit about how light can affect the human body. And actually, light does affect the human body in very, very interesting ways. So light is more than just a beautiful day, a nice view. It also, as we talked about, can affect the human body in two major different types of ways. There's the sleep, circadian rhythm, and mood, but there's also the effect of sunlight on your skin. We know that it can make vitamin D, and we're going to talk about this in this particular video as well. So remember that the mitochondria is the very important organelle in most of the cells of your body that produces energy. And just like an engine in your car, it can overheat, and the heat that's produced by its action can actually shut it down and threaten to shut it down. For the mitochondria, in this case, it's oxidative stress. And we've talked about before how oxidative stress has been implemented in less optimal health, things like inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, even learning disabilities like autism. But I would propose to you that it's also implicated in the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19. Now, your body has two different ways of cooling down this engine and preventing this oxidative stress, and both pathways involve melatonin. We know that at night, when you shut down for the night and you're not exposing your eyes to bright light, your pineal gland will make melatonin, which will make its way down to the mitochondria. Now, some people like to supplement with melatonin, and I don't have a problem with that so long as it's done at night. But the problem is that usually too much melatonin is very easy to get. Anything above 5 milligrams is way too much and actually can have an adverse effect on the body in terms of making you more irritable. And also, you don't really know, because melatonin is not regulated in the United States at least, we don't know that you're actually getting the melatonin that it says on the side of that bottle. So you have to do your homework and get good brands and making sure that you're getting it. The other problem with melatonin in the bloodstream is that it's signaling your body to say that it is nighttime. So how do you get melatonin to your mitochondria during the day without telling your body that you're going to bed? Well, that's the second part, and that's daytime. And what some scholars have proposed, based on evidence, is that in fact, the sunlight, and specifically near-infrared radiation, actually stimulates the mitochondria to produce its own melatonin right on the spot. We've talked about the solar spectrum, that only 39% of the energy coming from the sun can be seen as light, and that there is energy that you cannot see. In fact, the majority of the energy you cannot see, and specifically in this area of the longer wavelengths outside of red, that's why it's known as infrared, that there's near-infrared radiation. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. We've talked about before in other lectures, and I especially enjoin you to look at those other lectures here on Smart Lifestyle, that people who spent more time in the sun, whether they be multiple sclerosis patients or controls, had more gray matter and more whole brain volume. And we talked about the possibility that that near-infrared light could actually penetrate through the skull, through the cerebral spinal fluid, and to the gray matter that is on the outside of your brain. Well, what about COVID-19? Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and what's going on, because as we'll find out, this near-infrared radiation, which may cool down the mitochondria, may be the answer to a lot of the issues, and we'll go through the evidence. But the problem is that with COVID-19, oxidative stress, whether it be diabetes, whether it be obesity, seems to be a predictor of outcomes. And as we'll find out, COVID-19 is a perfect storm for oxidative stress. So we've seen on a number of occasions in a number of different diseases that every single time, at least for influenza, that at the end of the year, around December and going through to March and April, there's always a spike on an annual basis of influenza deaths per week in the United States. This is not rocket science. We know this, we predict it. There's even something known as a flu season. Why is this the case? Is it perhaps because of temperature? Is it perhaps because of humidity? Or is it perhaps because we're not getting enough sunlight during these periods of time? There's a lot of theories about this. Well, one of the studies seems to at least look at this for COVID-19. This was a scientific report that was published in Nature, a very prestigious journal, titled Autumn COVID-19 Surge Dates in Europe Correlated to Latitudes and Not to Temperature or Humidity, pointing to potentially vitamin D as a contributing factor. Well, we'll hold off on the vitamin D, but let's look at latitude. So this is a very interesting study. They looked to see when were the surges of COVID-19 during that first winter that we had. And when they sorted in Europe, all of the countries of Europe by temperature, they found a flat line. That means no correlation. So temperature had absolutely nothing to do with it. They did the same thing with humidity of the country at the time when the surge started. So in other words, in which country of Europe did the surge start first? And again, flat line, absolutely no correlation. But when they sorted it based on latitude, and latitude, of course, is tied to the amount of sunlight that you're getting in the wintertime, they found an amazing correlation, an R squared of 0.77, which is pretty significant. And they found that, sure enough, the most northern country in Europe, Finland in this case, had the first surge all the way to the very end, which was Greece, which is one of those countries in the most southern portions of Europe, which had it last. So in other words, there was a perfect correlation with latitude and not humidity and not temperature, pointing to sunlight potentially being something that's very important. And why might that be the case? Well, you need to understand this, that angiotensin II in the human body is a pro-oxidant. It increases blood pressure, and it's something that needs to be dealt with in the human body. And the human body has a way of dealing with it. It actually converts it from something harmful into something helpful called angiotensin 1,7, which is an antioxidant. As it turns out, the enzyme that does this is the famous or infamous ACE2 enzyme. Now, this just happens to be the receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And of course, that's important because this angiotensin 2 pro-oxidant in green is going to increase reactive oxygen species. That's not a good thing, but that's what's happening. But on the other hand, this beneficial product, angiotensin 1,7, is actually going to reduce reactive oxygen species. So that's important. So you can see very clearly that when the SARS-CoV-2 virus comes along and blocks the ACE2 receptor, it's going to shuttle things from going to the right to staying on the left, and it's going to increase reactive oxygen species. What's even more is that the virus is going to attract white blood cells, and white blood cells are going to increase reactive oxygen species. And that is going to lead to inflammation, that is going to lead to blood clots, that is going to lead to hypoxemia. This is exactly what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. This is what I saw in my intensive care patients, the patients that I took care of. They were vasculopaths. They had blood clots. They had pulmonary embolisms. They were sick. They were hypotensive. This is exactly the issues that we saw with these patients. And a lot of them already had reactive oxygen species issues. Why? Because they had poor mitochondrial function. So, how does the body deal with this? One way to deal with this is to soak up these reactive oxygen species with the all-powerful melatonin molecule. And how do you do that? Making sure you get enough sleep at night and actually making sure you're getting melatonin. We actually gave melatonin to our patients in the hospital at night to make sure that they were getting enough antioxidant therapy. And I imagine it helped in some of them. But the other way is sunshine during the day to make sure that you're getting melatonin right on the spot in the mitochondria via this near-infrared radiation. So you can see here that it's very possible, it's very likely, and we're going to look at this a little bit more here as we go on, that near-infrared radiation from the sun may be the way to mitigate a lot of the problems with reactive oxygen species. Let's put this another way. Imagine that you're not getting good night's sleep. Imagine that you're not getting outside into the sun. Imagine if your engine, if you will, is running a bit hot. Now you're driving along the road and you hit this hill called COVID-19. Are you going to make it over that hill without your engine shutting down? That's the question. So the question is what can we do to make sure that our engine is not running hot? What can we do to make sure that our cooling systems are in place? We're going to talk about that a little bit more right after we have a well-needed interlude, because we've talked about a lot of information. I want to introduce my brother on the piano, who's going to entreat us with an interlude to sort of adjust and digest this information. Thanks, Peter, and welcome back. Again, I'm your host, Dr. Roger Schwelt at Critical Care, and we've talked about this type of thing. Again, we're talking about reactive oxygen species and their increase in COVID-19. So, again, if you are an individual with these issues with mitochondrial dysfunction, diabetes, obesity, inflammation, you're on the edge of a cliff, and all it takes is a wind to blow you off that cliff, and that wind in this case could very well be COVID-19. So if you want to protect yourself from a virus that might come your way, you want to make sure that your reactive oxygen species are at the lowest point. So what's the evidence for COVID-19 using this reactive oxygen species mechanism to cause damage? And there was an interesting paper that was published in December of 2021 that looked at this, and they looked at 60 patients admitted to the hospital, and they measured something called GSH, which is the amount of antioxidants in the cell in these patients, T-bars, which is the marker of oxidative stress in the cells of these patients, and something called F2 isoprostane, which is a marker of oxidative damage. And this was published in 2022. So I want you to notice here that control groups are in blue and the COVID patients are in red. And what we have here is the younger age group, the middle age group, and the older age group. What I want you to notice here, first of all, is we're looking at the measures of antioxidants in your cell. So notice in the control group that as you get older, you have less antioxidants, which is why it's important that as you get older, you become more in tune to what you can do to your body to make sure that you are having fruits and vegetables, polyphenols, getting out into sunlight to improve your oxidative control. But notice that in every single age group, those that had COVID had less antioxidants. That means they were under more oxidative stress. But let's not end there. Let's look at more data. So now we're looking specifically at oxidative stress. And you can see here in the blue control groups that as you get older, naturally your oxidative stress is going to go up. And that could very well be the reason why elderly people were more likely to have morbidity and mortality from COVID-19. Because look, in COVID, notice that even though it was increasing, that at every age group and every point, there was more oxidative stress in each of these age groups. Again, leading to the theory and understanding that the way that COVID does its dirty work is through oxidative stress. And so it might be very beneficial to make sure that your oxidative stress is low. So finally, to round it out, we looked at F2 isoprostane, a measure of oxidative damage. Notice again, in every age group in the controls, as you go up in age, there is more damage, but at every point in every age group, COVID patients had more damage. And so certainly something to look at. Let's look at a couple of more issues in terms of COVID-19, and that's vitamin D. So we know that vitamin D has been shown in many cases to be associated with outcomes in COVID-19. There's been numerous studies that have shown that people with higher vitamin D levels do seem to do better with COVID-19. Where that's kind of not been exactly as obvious is whether or not supplementing with vitamin D can help prevent COVID-19. There's been some studies that have shown that that could be the case, other studies that show that it might not be. And so it could very well be that vitamin D is a marker of sun exposure, okay? So that means that if you have high vitamin D levels, it's possible that it's not the vitamin D levels themselves that are protecting you against COVID-19, but something else in the sunlight that you're getting from the sun. So here's some examples of what we're looking at. This is a study that looked at 185 subjects, and in both cases, clearly, those that had vitamin D levels below 12 nanograms per milliliter had much worse survival. Those that had it less than 20 had worse survival than those that had it greater than. So there's no question that vitamin D is at the very least a marker of survival. Whether or not supplementing improves it, the literature is mixed. The point is, though, is that when they looked at areas on the globe in the wintertime that was getting enough light to get near infrared radiation, but not enough light to get ultraviolet radiation, the question was, did they still see an improvement? In other words, if there were parts of the Earth during the wintertime where the sun is so low that there's no ultraviolet radiation coming in enough to give anybody any vitamin D, did they still see an improvement with latitude in those areas? If they did, then it would seem to indicate that vitamin D isn't the thing that's doing the heavy lifting, but something else in the light, perhaps the near-infrared radiation. So this is exactly what they did. They looked at the United States. They grayed out the area during the wintertime that could give enough ultraviolet radiation, and so they did not look specifically at those areas. They only looked at the portion of the United States that could not get enough ultraviolet radiation for vitamin D production. And what they still noted, that as you went up in latitude, okay, as you went from the top down to the bottom, but did not get ultraviolet radiation, there was a reduction in COVID-19 deaths per million. In other words, that even though the light that you were getting did not have vitamin D producing properties, the more light you were getting still improved outcomes in COVID-19. They did the same study in England. They found exactly the same result, that mortality went down as light exposure went up, devoid of vitamin D making. They noticed exactly the same thing in Italy. And so what they concluded, what the authors concluded, this was published in the British Journal of Dermatology, they said that this study is observational, and therefore any causal interpretation needs to be taken with caution. However, If the relationship identified proves to be causal, it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. Given that the effect appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. Folks, there's nothing new about this. We've been knowing this for a long time. We may have forgotten it, but if you were to look back at hospitals over 100 years ago, we built hospitals with solariums. We built hospitals with glass roofs. We built hospital rooms with patios where we could move the patients outside for what they called heliotherapy. That is, getting out into the sunshine, because we knew even then that there were health benefits of getting out into the sunshine. You can see these photographs here. Some of these are from Europe. Some of these are from the United States. They all agreed that getting out into sunlight was very important. Here we have a couple of quotes from people of that time. This was published of Ellen G. White. She says, "The feeble one should press out into the sunshine and earnestly and naturally, as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy deep green after enjoying for a few days the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power." That was 1871. She also says on the other side, "Don't sit up after 9 o'clock. Every light should be extinguished. This turning of night into day is a wretched, health-destroying habit." Why is this happening in the United States? Why is this happening in industrialized countries? Folks, look at this picture on the left. This is a near-infrared picture of a summer day in a wheat field. It is alight with near-infrared radiation. However, on the right is a potential picture in near-infrared of our homes, because our LED lights are no longer emitting any near-infrared radiation, and our windows are blocking it. Our schools, offices, and it's the fact that we're not getting outside. There's been some recent studies that have looked at this. Here in 1800, on the far left, the red bar indicates the amount of near-infrared radiation that somebody living in the 1800s would have received because they were in natural sunlight. 50% of the time they were outdoors and they would have a campfire at night, getting plenty of near-infrared radiation. In 1950, we had 100% incandescent light bulbs, which give off plenty of near-infrared radiation. Plain glass windows, 25% outdoors. So there was a reduction in the 1950s. By the time we get to the 1990s, we're now with 50% fluorescent bulbs, which do not give off near-infrared radiation. Plain glass windows are still in place, and we're only 15% of the time outdoors in the 1990s. And now with the advent of computers, smartphones, social media, kids, instead of playing outside in the streets, baseball, basketball, hide and seek, they're now indoors playing their video games and their virtual reality. And now what we have here at present is we have all of our bulbs in our homes are 100% visible only, which means they do not emit any energy. They don't waste any energy in the near-infrared spectrum. All of our glass in our homes now are low E glass, which means that they on purpose block near-infrared radiation to cut down on cooling. And we're only spending about 7% of our life outdoors. And so you can see where we have gone in the 1800s down to where we are today, there's been a dramatic reduction in the exposure of near-infrared radiation. If we look at bulbs, so let's look at the sunlight. This is the natural emission of sunlight. You can see here there is plenty of light in the visible spectrum. There is plenty of light in the near-infrared, and it goes way out into the near-infrared. For LED bulbs, we concentrate all of that energy into the visible spectrum, so we're not wasting any electricity or energy outside of what we can see. And so all of the light we're getting from LEDs, specifically ones designed for our home, are in the visible spectrum. Whereas the incandescent bulb here in blue, the majority of the light or the energy given off from that bulb is actually in the near-infrared. That's why it's very difficult to change an incandescent bulb that's been on only for a few seconds, because it gets very hot. That's exactly where that energy is going, and we're not getting any of that in near-infrared anymore. What about glass? Well, as you can see here, we're looking at the near-infrared spectrum here, and we can see here at the top, we've got what regular glass used to be 50, 100 years ago, it would be able to allow a lot of near-infrared radiation. You can tell because if you stand next to a window like that, and as the sun is coming up, you'll feel the heat of that sun coming through that window. But with the new glass that we're putting in, we've put that in for about 10 or 20 years now, we have high solar gain, low E, moderate solar gain, low E, and low solar gain, low E. And with those, if you stand on the other side of that glass, that sun might be up, but you will not feel the warmth on your skin because it's being filtered out. That low E glass reduces the amount of energy that you're getting in the near-infrared spectrum. And it is that scientists are proposing is what exactly causes your mitochondria to produce melatonin, which is the coolant for that mitochondria. So this is what we have. 100 years ago, this is what we had. We had a campfire. It was very dark. These campfires were giving off near-infrared radiation. They were low on the ground, so they were not stimulating the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in the inferior portion of our retina because it was reflecting to the superior portion of our retina, as opposed to today in Times Square, where we see all sorts of lights honking, beeping, and we see lights that are very high up, and they are reflecting, and they're blue, and all of these sorts of things. So this is the difference between what we had and what we have now. And the question is have we been entrapped by our own success? Are we feeling the results? Are we dealing with the health issues of our own technology and our own ability to do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do, even though it might not fit into our circadian rhythm? Notice what happens when we get up in the morning. When we get up in the morning, the sun comes up and the sun goes down. And the near-infrared photons that we get from that sun start to increase as we go during the day. Notice that ultraviolet light is also the highest at around noontime. And this is the damaging type of light, the type of damaging light that we want to avoid. How do you avoid that? Put sunscreen on. Ultraviolet light will not penetrate that, but near-infrared radiation will. Put on clothes, long sleeves. Ultraviolet light will not penetrate clothes, but guess what? Near-infrared will. And you can see there that we're getting that boost of melatonin to protect ourselves at just the moment that we need it to protect ourselves from the free radicals. So we've talked about how humans interact with light in terms of sleep, circadian rhythm, and mood, and also the mitochondria. And now we've talked about how, in fact, in certain viral infections, that getting out into the sun may actually beneficial. So what can we do? Get as much natural sunlight as possible, avoid glass, get outside. Exposure to low-level red light like fire and sunset at sunset time is advisable, and avoid any type of light exposure at sunset, especially blue light, and especially 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. Folks, there's a lot of things that you can do. We've talked about some things, some basic things that you can start to implement in your life to start reaping the benefits right away of light, melatonin, near-infrared radiation, to make sure that your mitochondria are exercising and operating at optimum capacity and avoid these pitfalls that we have in modern society. For Integrate Health, this is Dr. Roger Swell signing off.